Everly's Otherworldly Dilemma by Ellen O. Sweat pooled underneath Everly Young's helmet before dripping down the back of her neck. She maneuvered her bike around the heavy pedestrian traffic outside the Heights Galleria Mall. She could hear her best friend Max Bennett cursing behind her. August in Washington, D.C. was never a pleasant affair, especially when the tourists flooded the area. "Flying monkey turds!" Max shouted when Everly braked suddenly for a quartet of mothers pushing their baby strollers. The women took up the entire sidewalk as they chatted together, ignoring the people trying to get around them. "The mommy mafia are taking over the mall," Max said. "Don't try to get past them or they'll slime you with baby vomit." Everly groaned. "We only have a few weeks of summer left, and the movie starts in 15 minutes. Why won't they move?" "And I'm hungry," Max said. "You're always hungry," Everly retorted. Spotting a break in their stroller formation, Everly darted forward, eliciting a shout of anger from one of the moms. She could still hear the loud complaints as she raced ahead and pulled up to the partially full bike rack. "Thanks a lot," Mac groused as he locked up his bicycle next to hers. "How come I'm always the one that gets yelled at?" "'Cause you're too slow." She slipped her messenger bag over her shoulder and hurried Max along, joining the eager throngs of people trying to enter the mall. Each turn of the revolving doors sent refreshing waves of cold air over them. "Hurry up," Everly fanned herself. "I'm melting." When it was their turn, the two friends piled into the revolving door together and pushed their way into the bliss of air-conditioned paradise, only to find themselves jam-packed with even more people. Families with little kids, tourists with their big cameras, and groups of bored teens were everywhere. "Great mounds of elephant dung balls! Now we don't have time to hit the food court before the movie," Max complained. "That's okay, 'cause for some strange reason I'm not hungry," Everly said with a pointed look at Max. "I wonder why." "Ugh, sorry." Everly shook her head in disgust. "What is it with you and poop?" "It's a natural thing like gas. Everyone has it." "Don't want to hear it." "Like you don't do it. Shut up." The two friends bickered amicably as they shuffled along with the crowd and headed to the theater. After a short wait in the ticket line, they were heading to the concession stand to buy some popcorn, when Everly caught sight of something strange. The short man with the pointy nose who had just snuck into Theater 4 was most definitely a goblin. His hat gave him away. Goblins had huge ears that they could never disguise, so they relied on hats and other articles of clothing to cover them up. This goblin was wearing a black woolen skull cap on a scorching hot summer day, and given his stealthy movements, he was up to no good. But then again, goblins usually weren't. A rush of adrenaline surged through Everly's body as she stared at the goblin. She tugged at Max's arm, causing half his popcorn to spill out. "Turds on a stick! Look what you made me do!" He glared at her, blowing at the blonde swath of hair that always fell into his eyes. "Now I'm definitely not sharing." "Forget the popcorn," Everly yanked on Max's shirt. "You have to follow me." She headed down the hall and approached the double doors to Theater 4. Suddenly nervous, she clutched the messenger bag she always carried with her. She could do this. She could stop the goblin if he tried anything. With a deep breath, Everly reached for the door. Before she could open it, Max pulled away and peered up at the small marquee sign above the doors. "Wait a minute! This is The Return of Lolly and the Dandelion Gang. That's a little kid movie. We're supposed to see Furiously Fast in Space. Did you buy the wrong tickets?" He was digging his ticket out of his back pocket when Everly yanked the door open and shoved him in. "What are you doing?" Max whispered loudly. "We're hunting," Everly replied. Her eyes scanned the crowd for the goblin, while her ears were assaulted by the lollipop music from the large dancing possum on the screen. "Do we have to right now? And here, of all places, you know I hate that rat. Used to scare me to death when we were little." "It's a possum," Everly hissed. Max looked up at the screen and shuddered. "It still scares me. That's it. I'm getting out of here." He turned toward the door but stopped as Everly grabbed his skinny arm with a vice-like grip. Max flailed around a bit but succumbed to her greater strength. Everly has always been bigger than him. One day, I'm going to hit my growth spurt, and I'll be taller than you. You just wait, he said. Stop being a baby, or I'll tickle you. Everly and Max had been friends for over 10 years, and she knew exactly where to poke and tickle him for maximum irritation. Plus, if she tickled Max too hard, he always peed his pants. The threat silenced him. Everly maneuvered Max into the empty back row and forced him to sit next to her as she scanned every corner of the theater. Max cursed under his breath. Watch it! There are little kids all around us, Everly said. Yeah, well, it's your fault if they hear me. I shouldn't even be watching a dancing rat in a tutu. Possum. And its stupid gang of pukey, giggly flowers. Man, I hate that rat. Just then, Everly caught sight of the goblin and covered Max's mouth. Shh, right there. See him? She asked, pointing at the short man who was fixated on a small family seated a few rows ahead of him. Max peered over, only to lurch back in horror. That's a goblin! And a nasty-looking one, too! Everly nodded grimly, and I think he just found a perfect target. She pointed to a woman who was cradling a crying baby in one arm and trying to pass small cups of popcorn to her two other younger children. Her little girl kept sneaking out of her seat and into the aisle so she could dance along with the music, her eyes locked on the screen. Suddenly, the baby started wailing. The mother tried to soothe it, but the cries grew louder, disrupting the viewers around them. Don't do it, Everly muttered under her breath. Oh, come on, lady, don't leave those kids alone. She's totally gonna do it, Max muttered back. They watched as the mother said something to her oldest child. She pulled her young daughter back into her seat and then left the theater with the baby crying. She did it, Max said. They shared a quick look of worry. Don't take your eyes off those kids, Everly warned. Nervousness filled her stomach. She knew by the churning of her gut that the goblin was targeting this little girl. She slipped her hand into her messenger bag and gripped the handle of the torch that Max's dad had given her. The torch was supposedly the world's brightest flashlight, powerful enough to burn a hole through her bag in a minute. It was just the right tool for fighting goblins. Everly was 6 when she found out Max and his family were not human. Max was a shapeshifter, and his two dads were vegetarian werewolves. Everly thought it was the coolest thing in the world. She'd always adored fairy tales, and she'd wanted to believe they were true. When Max's dads, Adam and Jeff Bennett, realized Everly could see through the masks of the otherworldly, they taught her how to protect herself, specifically from the buraku, which are otherworldly that are considered dangerous. There was salt to repel magical creatures with evil intentions, a flashlight for goblins, imps, ghouls, and any folk who couldn't bear the light of the sun, and silver or iron to drive them all away. With her flashlight, Everly felt confident about tackling an evil goblin. Well, sort of. Truth was, she'd never had to drive an evil otherworldly away. Most of the magical creatures she knew were her friends, but this goblin was up to no good. Her churning stomach affirmed it. Everly took several calming breaths, willing herself to get up and approach the goblin. Maybe he was a vegetarian goblin who was only in the theater to watch the Lolly movie because he was a big fan of possums. Maybe he was only staring at the little girl because she was such a good dancer, and not because she looked delicious. Sweat dotted her forehead. No excuses. She had to get rid of the goblin. Just as Everly was planning her approach, the little girl jumped out of her seat and began dancing in the aisle. Her older brother was paying no attention to her. He was too busy laughing at the impossible gymnastics of the large possum, who was dancing and singing and playing the banjo on the big screen. The goblin rose and approached stealthily. Everly jumped to her feet. There was no time to plan. She had to stop him. Flying monkey turds! Max shouted. There were frowns, and one mother loudly shushed them. Everly used the distraction to plop the little girl back into her seat. From her bag, she grabbed her torch and was about to use it on the goblin when he disappeared. Everly turned to Max. You stay here and make sure that goblin doesn't come back to her. Wait, Everly, Max said, but she was gone. Goblins had the ability to teleport short distances. She scoured the hallway and caught sight of the slight swing of a nearby door. She tore through it and entered a dark, narrow hallway. Everly switched on her powerful flashlight and pointed it at the goblin. He shrieked frantically, covering his eyes. "What do you propose to do with me?" The goblin's voice was sharp and high. That was a really good question. Everly was only trying to stop the goblin from taking the girl. She hadn't thought beyond that. "You need to leave and never come back. If I ever catch you here again, you're going to be sorry," Everly said, with more confidence than she really had, which was none at the moment. "Sorry, worthless human, you have no power over me. You're a mere mortal." The goblin sneered, but his hands were still covered his eyes. He surged forward, knocking Everly onto the floor. Her flashlight rolled into the corner. The goblin crowed as he wrapped his cold, spindly hands around Everly's foot and dragged her toward him. She kicked at him wildly, connecting with his nose. Snap! He let out a keening sound of pain. Everly reached for her horseshoe magnet and stabbed the prongs into the goblin's face. He gave a terrifying shriek and released her, steam rising from the 2 square marks on his cheek. Everly dropped the magnet into her bag and retrieved the torch. Then she scrambled to her feet. As she ran for the door, she pulled out a large container of sea salt. "Foul human!" the goblin shouted. He jumped up and charged after her. She could smell his rancid breath. Tucking the torch under her arm, she shook a handful of sea salt into her hand and threw it at the goblin, just as his claw-like fingers raked through her ponytail. The goblin fell away, yelping. The illusion of his human visage completely stripped away. Everly could now see his true form. Pale gray, wrinkled skin covering a misshapen body, and a gruesome face that was all sharp teeth and pointed features. Unnerved, Everly was backing toward the door when a silver net flew past her and dropped onto the goblin. It immediately tightened over the creature, immobilizing him. Everly whirled around and caught sight of the 2 tall teenagers wearing forest green uniforms. One was a beautiful girl in rich shades of brown, dark brown hair, light brown skin, and medium brown eyes. She stood next to a tall, handsome, red-headed boy with brown eyes. He held a golden trident in his right hand, and chains of the same silver netting wrapped diagonally across his torso. Golden rune symbols were embroidered on their left breast pockets. For the first time since chasing the goblin, Everly felt cold fear in the pit of her stomach. They were shinobi rangers, responsible for patrolling the Awari Gate, the only access point between their world and the other world. Her eyes darted to the empty hallway behind the rangers. If Max came back, he'd be in terrible danger. The rangers stared down at the goblin, who was still shrieking. The girl spoke first. "The salt and flashlight were smart, but it was foolish of you to tackle a goblin alone, especially this one." The goblin finally went silent. "We've been following this scum for days now. You're lucky to be alive." Redhead pointed to his trident at the goblin. A shining light gleamed from its 3 tips, surrounding the frightened creature. "What are you doing?" Everly yelled. The light intensified all around the goblin. Moments later, he was gone. "Did you kill him?" Everly asked. The older girl shook her head. "No. Unfortunately, he has to go to trial first. We sent him directly to prison." Everly was relieved. Even though the goblin was evil and had tried to kidnap a child, she didn't want to see anyone killed. Just the idea of it made her queasy. "Tell me, how long have you been able to see the otherworldly?" the girl asked. "Otherworldly?" Everly played dumb. "We police the Awari Gate between our worlds vigilantly, but some scum, like that goblin, find a way to sneak in. Normal people can't see them, but you can, right?" Everly nodded cautiously. "What have your dealings been with them?" the boy asked in a clipped voice. "Are they your friends?" "No, they usually run away from me." "You're lucky," he said. "You could have been kidnapped, or worse." Everly shrugged. "They seemed harmless, but some really scare me." The ranger glared at her. "You are dead wrong. They should all scare you." Everly jutted her chin. "You're kind of scary too," she said, then asked, "Are you an otherworldly?" The ranger's glare turned icy cold. "I'm nothing like them. I'm human. Cameron Morrison, captain of the Shinobi Rangers." "Wow, you seem awfully young to be a captain." The ranger smirked. You know nothing. Correction, you know a little something, but nothing truly important, which makes you a danger to yourself and others. The other ranger laughed at his words. Everly fought back her temper. I was just curious because you're using magic. Just because I'm utilizing magical weapons does not mean I'm using magic, Ranger Morrison retorted. Everly's mouth formed into an O at his jerky attitude. Sorry, I didn't mean to offend. She began to inch toward the door, desperately wanting to get away from them. Before Everly could make a run for it, though, the ranger plucked the flashlight from her hand. Hey, that's mine! Give it back! Cameron asked, how does someone who has never dealt with the otherworldly know how to use salt iron and a powerful flashlight? Everly's brain froze, her tongue heavy and thick in her mouth. Staring at his cold, dark eyes, Everly got the chills. He wouldn't hesitate to use his trident on Max and his dad's. The internet, duh, she scowled. If you saw weird, creepy things that no one else could see, wouldn't you search it online to make sure you could protect yourself? The girl ranger chuckled. I like you. I'm Darcy Watson, and I think you're going to be a real asset. Asset to what? The Ranger Cadet Program. Huh? Everly could feel her mouth gaping open. Forcing it shut, she looked at the two rangers with a wary gaze. This was not good. She wasn't supposed to catch their notice. The rangers were just as much the enemy as the goblin was. She wondered how she could get away without making them suspicious. Goblins are sneaky and dangerous, Darcy said, but you were able to follow him and immobilize him, at least for a little while. You're brave, if a bit reckless, and definitely cadet material. Darcy's words made her extremely nervous. Before she could thank her, Cameron interrupted. Don't be so sure. There's a fine line between reckless and stupid. I don't think she's ranger material. A fierce anger rose up Everly's chest, burning her throat. That was the last straw. You don't know anything about me, she spit out. You think you're better than me, but you're not. You're just a know-it-all teenage loser. I didn't ask for your help, so why don't you just leave me alone? Darcy raised her hands to placate her. He doesn't mean any disrespect. He's just suspicious of everyone. He doesn't even trust his own grandmother. With a snort, Everly began to walk away, but Darcy stepped in front of her. Look, what we should have told you from the start is that anyone who has the sight to be recruited into the cadets. We need them, she said. Rangers don't last past the age of 18 when we lose our sight. We need to recruit any potential ranger to our cadet program. Thanks, but no thanks, Everly said, still angry with Cameron. It's not like my parents are going to let me join anyway. Cameron humphed. Let her go, he said. Told you she's not cadet material. She doesn't have what it takes. What's that? Being a humongous jerk? Cameron gave Everly a disgusted look, but Darcy cut him off before he could speak. Everly, don't listen to him. This is about keeping people safe. You do care about your friends and family, don't you? A chill went through her at Darcy's words. Of course, Everly said. That was the problem. She was very worried for her friends. Join the cadet program and fight for our human right to live free of dangerous otherworldly creatures, Darcy said. But I'm only 12, Everly protested. Darcy exchanged amused glances with Cameron. I was 9 and Darcy was 10 when we joined, he said. We knew it was our duty and we were proud to do it. Not to join would have been unpatriotic. He paused a moment, looking her over. But you probably don't care about things like patriotism and civic duty. At that moment, Everly would have given anything to have the magical ability to turn Cameron into a cockroach and stomp on him. Instead, she said, I don't like you. Listen, don't let him get to you, Darcy said. I promise the rest of us aren't like him. Why don't you come to headquarters tomorrow and meet the others and the chief? You need to do that before making any decision. Everly wanted to say no. She knew she should say no, but something about the condescending smirk on the older boy's face made her want to prove him wrong. Darcy held up her hand and showed Everly her large pearl ring. If you're a cadet, you get to try out the magical weapons in our arsenal and find the one that suits you best, Darcy said. She aimed the pearl at the far wall, and it released a pure white light that was more powerful than Everly's torch. Darcy smiled at the wonder and longing on Everly's face. So what do you say? Everly didn't respond right away. Her eyes drifted from the magic pearl to the golden trident and the silver netting. To be able to use magical weapons would almost be like having magic, she thought. I have kendo on Saturday mornings, but I'm free all afternoon, Everly said slowly. Darcy smiled in relief. Great! Meet me in the front of the theater at 1 p.m. tomorrow. I'll take you to headquarters myself. Fine, but I don't want him coming, Everly pointed at Cameron. Cameron smirked back at her. As you wish. He banged his trident on the ground. Cameron and Darcy vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Even though the mom and baby had returned, Max was still watching out for the kids in the possum movie. Everly filled him in. Horrified, Max insisted that they go and tell his dads right away. Being next-door neighbors with her best friend had always been really convenient for Everly, ever since her parents were high-ranking federal officials who were always working. Max's house was Everly's second home. Walking into Max's living room, she saw a familiar scene. Adam, Max's accountant father, was arguing with Marie in the living room, while Jeff, the artist, was in the kitchen making dinner. Marie was a real-life fairy, and also Max's godmother, his fairy godmother. Everly always had to chew her lip to stop from laughing about that fact, but it gave her great joy to call Max Cinderella whenever he got on her nerves. We have a problem, Max announced ominously. Everly was contacted by shinobi rangers. The adults all gasped in horror. Give us the details, Everly, the fairy said. Don't leave anything out. Taking a deep breath, Everly launched into the events of the day. When she was done, the house was absolutely quiet, except for the crunching of Max's potato chips. Adam let out a heavy sigh. You'll have to avoid them all for a while. No, she has to go, Marie interjected. This is exactly what we need. You can't be serious. It's not safe. You underestimate her abilities. No, you underestimate the depth of the shinobi prejudice. Adam, times are changing, said Marie. Not for us, Adam said. You're a fairy, so it's different for you. No, I've been discriminated against too. In the blink of an eye, Adam's smooth blonde look shifted to those of a snarling werewolf. His pretty blue eyes turned blood red, and his lips retracted to show a fearsome array of sharp, elongated canines. Don't you dare, Marie! Don't try to compare your experience to ours. You left the fairy court because you befriended the Baraku. That's not the same. You can never know what it feels like to be one of us, feared and despised by all. She made an impatient sound. You know as well as I do that the shinobi do not differentiate among the otherworldly. They will hunt down a rogue fairy no differently than a rogue Baraku. Adam's werewolf face receded. You're so naive. A fairy is not the enemy until they turn, but the Baraku are always the hunted, even if we've never harmed anyone in our lives, not just by the shinobi, but by King Magnus and the other fairy army, and our own fellow citizens. It is how things have always been. It's why we left the other world. But if things don't change, this world will be no different, she said sharply. Both Adam and Jeff looked horrified. Don't tell me you had a vision, Jeff asked. She nodded. War is coming. I've seen it. And this time it will not be contained to the other world. What do you mean, Aunt Marie? Asked Everly. During the First War, the shinobi rangers and the fairy army kept the fighting from entering the human world, Max said. Well, that's the official version, the fairy said, and that's why we are in trouble. Modern rangers have been taught to hunt the Baraku, but they and humans don't realize that the fairy folk are the real enemies. We must prepare for war. How? Jeff asked in a despairing voice. Last time, an army of samurai warriors protected the gate. Now, the rangers are just a bunch of kids who chase down stray Baraku. They aren't ready for this. And that's where Everly comes in, said Marie, turning to Everly. You can join the cadet program and help unite the rangers and the Baraku. Everly asked, I've been told over and over again how important it is to avoid the rangers. Why are you telling me to become one? This isn't a good idea. If the rangers investigate her, they'll find all of us, Adam said. It's a risk, Marie admitted, but there's no other choice. I don't know, Aunt Marie. Everly was shaking her head in dismay. I'm not sure I can help. The fairy floated to Everly and grabbed her hands. But will you try? Of course, Everly said. Marie's smile was brilliant. Then I have something for you. She held up a small purple stone decorated with a beautiful pattern of golden runes. This is a magic fairy stone, she said. If you accept it, magic will begin to grow inside of you. You have no right to do this, Adam protested. This is Everly's choice, said Marie. She's just a kid, Jeff chimed in. If war comes, being a child will not protect her. The two werewolves subsided. Magnus, the fairy king, would enslave the human race while trying to annihilate the Baraku. We are all in danger. The fairy paused. But in my vision, I saw you, Everly. Everly blinked in surprise. Me? What was I doing? You were dressed like a ranger and leading an army of Baraku. It will be perilous. The outcome is uncertain, but seeing you gave me a sense of hope. So I ask you again, will you try to help us? Yes, I will. Everly responded firmly. Marie smiled and handed Everly the stone. Suddenly the room faded away, along with Max and his two fathers. The pale blue walls of the Bennett house disappeared, and the Persian rug morphed into thick, tall grass. Everly felt the cool night breeze blow through her ponytail. Everly and Marie were in a forest, standing within a ring of stones and wildflowers. A full moon shone brightly in a star-filled sky, bathing the area in a soft light. The grass tickled Everly's bare feet. She could smell honeysuckle and pine trees. A hard shiver slid down her spine as she stared at the dark forest surrounding them. Where are we? Everly asked. We're in the dream woods of the Otherworld, said Marie. Only our spirits are here. Our bodies are still back at Max's house. So I'm dreaming? More like a waking dream, the fairy responded. But why am I here? My dear child, what I'm asking of you will be dangerous. I can't ask you to do it defenseless. That is why I'm going to give you a choice, Marie said. She looked at the stone in Everly's hand and traced a delicate finger over the symbols on it. These are runes. Anzu Awai Exi. They represent good fortune, protection, and defense. Rune magic is ancient and powerful. I don't know what powers the runestone will give you, because everyone is different. But I know that with this stone and your training in the use of the magical weaponry, you will become the greatest and most powerful ranger. Before you accept, though, you must make a choice. Magic is a powerful responsibility. If you willingly accept it, you will become a defender of the otherworldly. You will become, in part, one of those hunted by the very people you are planning to join. Once you accept, you can never undo it, even if you come to hate it. Why would I hate it? I've always wanted to have magic, said Everly, excitement rising within her. This was a dream come true. Let me show you why, the fairy said, right before she disappeared along with the purple stone. This light dimmed, and the heaviness of the night pressed against Everly's flesh. Her eyes darted to the dark forest. A dreadful sound filled her ears. Something was moving in the shadows, something big and hulking. The putrid smell of death and decay struck her, and her eyes widened with horror at the sight. A gigantic troll lumbered toward her. Aunt Marie, where are you? Everly shouted. Her heart hammered as she stared in the dismay at the troll. Its skin was gray and filthy. She could see the sharp, jagged teeth in its wide crevice of a mouth as it grunted at her. It stood just outside the fairy circle, drool running down its craggy jaw, its massive hands extended toward her. But it stepped no further. Everly realized it couldn't cross the ring of stones surrounding her. Just as she began to breathe again, The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, making her pivot. She screamed in terror as a bevy of supernatural creatures came at her. Full-on werewolves that were nothing like Jeff and Adam bared their fearsome fangs, followed by goblins, kappas, fox demons, centaurs, ogres, witches, and vampires. They stood around the edge of the fairy circle watching her. Everly didn't know what they wanted. She didn't know what she was supposed to do. They were frightening. She closed her eyes and remembered what Adam had just said. The Baraku are always the hunted. Everly took a deep breath. How was she to know who was safe and who would see her as a meal? This wasn't the same as the goblin situation where she knew he was up to no good. She opened her eyes and noticed how patient and quiet they were. No gnashing of their teeth, no grunting or shrieking or howling. Even the troll stood quietly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. What were they waiting for? What did they want? Everly remembered the Baraku greeting of protection that Jeff had taught her. She slowly turned in a circle, catching the gaze of every creature before her, and bowed. Peace to you, my brothers and sisters. I mean you no harm. There was a moment of utter stillness before all the Baraku bowed in return. But still, they waited. Everly realized she couldn't stay in the circle all night. If they meant her no harm, then she had to trust them. She had to step out of the protective circle. Everly held a hand to her rapidly beating heart. She stepped out. Immediately the Baraku moved aside and lined up to form a path. Everly bowed again and walked past them until she reached a large rock, where the purple runed stone sparkled. When she turned around, the Baraku had vanished. She was alone. "Marie, are you here?" Everly yelled. The night was quiet all around her. Everly stared at the stone, hearing the fairy's words again. Once you accept it, you can never undo it. Everly had always wanted magic, but now that the offer was before her, she didn't know if it was the right thing to do. But she thought of Max and Jeff and Adam. She thought of how if they'd had to escape from the other world because they were hunted by the fairy folk, if war came to her home, then none of them would ever be safe again. She would never forgive herself if something happened to her friends and her family. Plus, just how powerful could she be with magic? She picked up the stone. It began to warm, and the symbols seemed to glow from within. Everly looked around. What was she supposed to do now? She pressed the stone to her chest just as it flashed a hot, bright light. She felt a sharp, stinging pain, and then the heat was burning from within, as if she were being consumed alive. It was so hot she wanted to rip her clothing off. She would have screamed, but she was paralyzed. Just as she thought she made a horrifying mistake, the fire went out and she was back in Max's house, lying on the floor with everyone staring at her. "Aunt Marie, was I carrying a weapon in your vision?" She nodded. "Cool," said Everly. "I'm so ready."